Lecture 13, The Book of Genesis.
Thus far in our course, we have discussed heroes and myths and history from the ancient Middle East, from classical Greece. We've discussed great books like the Iliad, the Athenian tragedies, Gilgamesh. And still today, these books are read. These books convey profound moral truths. But no one today, I think, there may be a few, but no one today takes very seriously the gods of ancient Greece. I don't think you will find very many worshipers of Shamash and Anu from the ancient Middle East. We want to turn now, though, to a book that is read every day by millions, I would dare say even billions of people, and that still shapes their lives. That was a product of the second millennium BC, the same age that saw the development of the Gilgamesh and saw the events which would become enshrined in Greek mythology. I mean, of course, the Bible. The Bible. It is the source for two great world religions, Judaism and Christianity, and it exercised, in the form of the Old and New Testament, a significant influence upon the development of a third great world religion, Islam. We can talk of the Bible and believe that every word in it is true. We can talk of the Bible and dispute every word in it. This does not change the fact that the Bible conveys supreme moral values and truth that for centuries have shaped people's lives. And I think we should begin at the beginning, in the beginning, with the book of Genesis. The title itself is Greek, and it represents the fact that one of the most widely used versions of the Bible, already in the 3rd and 2nd century BC, was not the Hebrew text, but a Greek translation made for the Jewish congregation in Alexandria and Egypt at the behest and with the funding of King Ptolemy, a Greek king of Egypt. In the beginning, though, is the Hebrew title, simply taking the first words of the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis falls into two primary parts. The first 11 chapters deal with the universal question of how did the world come into being? And then the remainder of the book deals with the relationship of this universal God who brought the whole of the world and the whole of its people into being, the relationship of that universal God to his chosen people, the people of Israel. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God moved across the waters. And he said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Such a magnificent, eloquent, poetic beginning. And God divided the firmament from the waters, creating, in other words, the great dome of heaven. And God divided the waters from the land and planted on that land all manner of vegetation. And then the sun and the moon and the stars, giving the sun domination over the day and the moon the domination over the night. And God also saw that there was a need for great creatures of the sea, and then animals. And there was also man. And God created man in his own image. In his own image he created man. 6 days. And then on the seventh day he rested. He was content with his work. Now there are many, many creation myths. I think every civilization I have studied has its creation myth. The Greeks have a creation myth. We find it first in Hesiod, a younger contemporary of Homer, composing around 730 BC. I find it coarse. First there was chaos, and out of chaos came broad-bosomed Earth Mother Goddess, and she, without mingling in love, brought forth the heaven, and then mingling in love with heaven, Earth brought forth the Titans. I find that an utterly incoherent version of the beginning of the world. Scholars, once they began to uncover in the 19th century, the clay tablets from Babylon that we have discussed, began to see that the Babylonians had a creation myth and that certain elements of it were common with the myth of creation that we find in the book of Genesis. But I find that too coarse. All sorts of monsters fighting among themselves, gods fighting among themselves. I agree with Isaac Singer in his magnificent novel that we discussed in an earlier course, The Penitent. Of all the scientific explanations, of all the cultural explanations of the beginning of the world, I find the account in Genesis the most simple, the most beautiful, and the most moving. And behind it is that God is one, not many, and God has enough love in him to create the whole of the world. And the apex of his creation is man. And it doesn't bother me that there seem to be two somewhat different versions of the creation of man. The one in which he is simply created on the sixth day in the image of God, and the other which has God bending over the dry earth, for no rain has yet fallen upon it. And he breathes upon that dry earth and fashions the first man, Adam, and doesn't want Adam to be alone, doesn't want him to be lonely, and thus creates out of Adam's own body woman, Eve. And he wants them to be happy. He loves these creations, and he puts them in a Garden of Eden, divided by great rivers, with everything they could possibly want at their disposal. Garden of Eden, too, is a widespread myth. And of course, for our old friend Ignatius Donnelly that we discussed in our lecture on Atlantis, the original Garden of Eden was Atlantis. But once again, the account that we find in Genesis has a beauty and a coherence to it that I think is unsurpassed. So there are Adam and Eve in this garden with everything they want. But the Bible is a most perceptive student of human nature, and it is in our very nature to destroy what is perfect. And the two of them are nude. They know no shame. The serpent approaches them and offers them the first temptation. And that temptation is, if you will partake of this fruit of the tree of knowledge, then you will be like the gods. You will know good and evil. But that's the one fruit we've been told we dare not eat. That's because God doesn't want you to be as wise as he is. And so Eve urges Adam, and they partake of that fruit. And God, very anthropomorphic vision of God, is strolling in this beautiful garden that he's created in the cool of the evening. And he comes upon his two creations, and they're wearing coverings over themselves. Why are you wearing these covers? Well, we did not want to be seen by you in the nude. We'd be ashamed. How did you know that you were in the nude? You have partaken of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and now you must pay for your sin. So God drives them out of the Garden of Eden. They have squandered their chance. And the woman will now bring forth her children in pain. And Adam will have to earn his bread, as all of us do, by the sweat of his brow. And man's foot will be ever turned against the serpent who has brought about this evil. Well, a profound moral truth that I believe we must still consider today. We have become, in these last 2 generations perhaps, like gods. Our knowledge has grown so tremendous. Our technology has brought us so much information and so little real wisdom. So we can now, like a god, create human life through cloning. We can, like a god, go into the very center of creation and break the atom. But we don't know what to do with this. Still today, nuclear power can run rampant. And believe me, humans, if they're not already cloned, will be, and will be faced with the huge moral dilemma of, are these humans with rights? Are they something different? No, in the Garden of Eden, this innocence was lost and the fruit of knowledge was eaten by man and taken into himself, then we have forever thereafter been our own worst enemies. And God set up a great fiery figure to protect this Garden of Eden so Adam and Eve and no one else could ever enter it again. So it's gone. It's gone forever. Adam knows Eve, and they have their children, Cain and Abel. And Cain is a tiller of the fields. And Abel is a hunter. And there, as we saw also in the Gilgamesh, the enmity between those who dwell in little towns and grow their food and plow the ground, and those who go out like a warrior and hunt. And God was pleased with the sacrifice brought in by the hunter. And Cain, his pathetic little fruits of the earth, well, they weren't that much. And so Cain turned on his brother and slew him. How many times in the stories that we have told, the myths that we have examined, has brother killed brother? But that is, of course, nothing more than an analogy, metaphor for how humans kill each other. And thus, God comes looking and asks Cain, where is your brother? Am I my brother's keeper? And God seems to think, yes, we all are. And you will thus be banished. Every man's hand will be against you. Then how will I survive? I will put upon you the mark of Cain. So the world begins in perfection, loses its innocence, and then turns to fratricide. No wonder God began to doubt the wisdom of this creation of humans. And the more he pondered it, the more he became convinced that this had been a dreadful failure, and the thing to do was simply to eliminate the human race. But there was one righteous man, Noah. One righteous man, we must assume, in the whole world. And that has been a constant theme through Judaism, that if you can find one righteous individual, you can be saved. And that would, of course, become the fundamental mystery of Christianity, that one supremely righteous individual could save all of humanity. So Noah is righteous. And God comes to him and says, I am going to destroy the earth with a mighty flood. And I want you to build an ark, take your family, and put upon that ark 2 of every animal, clean and unclean. And when the rain comes, you will preserve life. And of course, the neighbors no doubt thought that Noah had lost his mind building this ark. But here is the theme and the profound truth of both Judaism and Christianity and of Islam, that you must put your faith absolutely and totally in God. You do not question God. In fact, that is what the very word Islam means, is absolute submission. Noah builds his ark, and the waters come. We've seen that there is a story of the flood in the Gilgamesh, very similar to that we find in the book of Genesis. But in Genesis, it rains for 40 days, and finally, Noah's ark comes on top of a mountain, and the waters began to recede. And with slight variation from what happened in Gilgamesh, in terms of the birds, but the first bird is sent out, comes back immediately. The waters are still too high. There's nowhere to light on land. The second goes out and brings back a twig. So the waters are receding. And the third comes back no more. And Noah can now bring his family out, the animals out. And God makes a covenant with this righteous man. This is my rainbow. I shall place it into the sky. And that is my promise that never again will I destroy the human race. Now, a student of mythology would tell you that this is clearly an etiological myth. That is to say, someone asked, why are rainbows in the sky? And this story was then made up. Well, I'm not going to dispute that in detail, but it is to just dismiss the pure beauty of this story, the most wonderful thing that can happen after a storm is to look out your window and see that glorious rainbow. And if you think inside yourself, that is a promise that no matter how evil the human race is, righteous men and women will be found and it will continue. Then the human race continued to multiply. And they all spoke, we're told in the book of Genesis, the same language. And they again became proud. They became filled with hubris, as the Greek would have said. The Hebrews knew all about hubris. Pride goeth before a fall. And the pride of this united human race was to raise up a tower all the way to heaven to show that they were as mighty as God himself. God tumbled down the tower and made all the peoples of the earth speak different languages. Now, there is, no matter how skeptical you are, a clear kernel of truth in the story of the Tower of Babel, because the great cities of Mesopotamia, like Babylonia, built these high-rise temples, ziggurats. But it's also interesting that when scientists go into these issues, they are still no more clear than Genesis in some regards. There was a book published some years ago, made quite a stir, The Daughters of Eve. And it argued, based on DNA studies, that all humans were descended from an original human individual. And scholars of linguistics have many different theories about how the various language groups came into being. The Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic, Indo-European languages like Persian and German and Russian and Greek and Latin, the languages of the Ural-Altaic group like Finnish and Mongolian. But there are some quite reputable scholars who believe that all languages of the earth derive from one prototype. So, the book of Genesis is asking questions, universal questions. How did the world come into being? Why do we have a rainbow? Why do we all speak such different languages? Now that's the universal God. And when the story of the flood and the Tower of Babel comes to an end, when we learn about Nimrod, the mighty hunter, descended from Noah, who first began to build an empire, we are told, and created mighty cities throughout Babylonia. When that comes to an end, we begin, in chapter 12, the story of the patriarchs. And this is when the still universal God becomes the special divine patron of Israel. And with Abraham, makes his covenant that the Israelites will become a mighty nation, numerous as the stars, as numerous as the sand pebbles on the beach. And they will be a ruling nation as long as they keep faith with God. And as the sign of this special covenant, they will circumcise their youth, their boys. And this circumcision, this will be fundamental to the covenant. And Abraham, finally at the age of 100, doubting that such a thing is possible, also given the age of his wife, has a child, a boy, Isaac, born to him by his own legitimate wife. And God then says, you must take this one precious son and take him out and offer him up as a human sacrifice to me. Well, we saw what Agamemnon did in that situation, and Abraham absolutely submits to this demand by God. And Isaac asked his father, Dad, where are we going? And we're going to offer a sacrifice. Where's the ram? God will provide. And God does provide. Very differently than Zeus and Artemis, these Greek gods. God, because Abraham has so trusted in him, suddenly there's a ram struggling around in the bushes, and he has offered up, the ram is, in sacrifice. Abraham the patriarch, all the way down to Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Each of them wandering herdsmen. And the fundamental creed of the Hebrew, found in Deuteronomy, is, my father was a wandering Aramaean, a Semitic-speaking Bedouin. And God brought him down into the land of Egypt because he was hungry. And there we became a mighty nation. And the Egyptians oppressed us. And God brought us out of Egypt and brought us into this land of milk and honey. That is the ancient prayer to be said as sacrifices are laid out to the God of Israel, to the God Yahweh. And there was indeed hunger in the land. And historically speaking, already by the 16th century, we find in the Egyptian records, Haibiru. That's a controversial word. To me, it's quite clear that it means a wandering nomad, but then will be taken over by the Hebrews. But wandering nomads, Haibiru, come into Egypt inside the borders to find food and to find work. But even without hunger, you could be brought into the land of Egypt. And Jacob in his old age had a favorite son. He had many sons, but his beloved was Joseph. And Joseph was the special favorite. Everything he wanted, he got. And he was also a dreamer. And he told his brothers about his dreams, how the brothers were gathering up all these sheaves of grain, and when they got them all into bundles, they bowed before him. "Who is this dreamer?" they said, "and our father's probably going to leave him almost all of his inheritance." So they were out tending their flocks, and Joseph came to bring them lunch, wearing his very special striped robe, his coat of many colors that had been made at great expense and with great love. And his brothers said, "Let's kill him." Oh, I don't know. One of the brothers was a little squeamish about that and said, "Why don't we just throw him into this pit and we can think about what we want to do to him?" And as they had thrown him into the pit, suddenly there came a caravan. Very real historical fact. Traders on their way into Egypt, and they sold their brother up as a slave, and he went down into Egypt. And there, as a slave, was taken into the home of an important Egyptian official, Potiphar. And we know indeed that Semitic slaves, that nomadic slaves captured were servants in the household of powerful Egyptians. And Joseph showed himself to be extraordinarily capable. And Potiphar put more and more interest in him and gave him more and more authority. But he was also handsome. And Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. And when she failed, and eager to get away from her machinations, Joseph ran out of the house and left behind his coat. She then showed this coat to her husband and said how Joseph had tried to seduce her. Joseph ends up in jail. And there he is, supposedly abandoned by his God, his family having sold him into this terrible situation. There are two men in there with him. They all three have come from somewhat high positions, Joseph and these two. One has been chief baker to Pharaoh, and one has been his cupbearer, bringing him his wine. And they both have had dreams. And the dreams are told, and Joseph said, "Well, you, with those vines growing out of your head, in 3 days, you will be back as the cupbearer. And you baker, those birds biting into your head, within 3 days, your head is going to be hanging on a tree." And so it was. And when the cupbearer got back into the good graces of Pharaoh, Joseph had urged him to remember me. But people never remember the favors you do them. But 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. And his dream was, for example, of 7 big fat cows coming out of the river, and then 7 lean cows eating them. And a series of dreams like this. And suddenly, the cupbearer said, "Hey, I know someone who can interpret this for you." And Joseph is finally hauled out of jail and made, because his interpretation is, there will be 7 years of good growth and then 7 years of famine. And you must collect enough good material, enough food, these 7 good years, so that when the famine comes, you can distribute the land of Egypt with food. And Pharaoh takes his advice. And ultimately, Joseph becomes his grand vizier. And Joseph introduces, in order to serve Pharaoh, one of the first truly recorded instances of excessive taxation. For famine strikes again, and Pharaoh is told by Joseph, "Why don't you get people to give you all of their grain, all of your money, and then give you all of their cattle? And then, finally, in order to get grain from you, they will have to give you 20% of all they make." And so, less taxes than we pay now, but exorbitant by ancient standards, The whole of Egypt, except for the priest. They're sort of like not-for-profit institutions today. The priests don't have to pay taxes, but all the rest of the people of Egypt will pay this 20% to Pharaoh. And so Joseph grows older, serving Pharaoh, the second most powerful man in the whole of Egypt. And so the Egyptians and the Hebrews lived together there in the land of Egypt. And it is out of Egypt that God will lead them in the Exodus.